Imani Williams arrived at Iron Vale Academy with her grandfather's faded GI and a scholarship she never applied for, the acceptance letter bearing a cryptic warning: legacy earns more than blood. They destroyed Moses Carter 20 years ago, and now someone wanted his granddaughter inside their elite walls where Ryder Thompson's black belt crew immediately marked her for destruction. What these privileged predators didn't know was that the quiet scholarship girl with secondhand gear carried more than her grandfather's techniques. She carried his unfinished war, and Iron Vale was about to discover that some fights skip generations, waiting for the right moment to settle old scores. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, cutting through the silence of the cramped apartment like a blade. Imani Williams rolled over on her narrow bed, her hand instinctively reaching for the worn leather bag beside her nightstand. Inside, carefully folded with the reverence of a sacred relic, lay her grandfather's old GI. The white fabric had yellowed with age, and the belt, a faded black with frayed edges, still carried the faint scent of the gym where Moses Carter had trained decades ago. She held the GI against her chest for a moment, feeling the weight of memories it carried. Her grandfather had been gone for 3 years now, but his presence lingered in every fiber of that uniform. The apartment around her was small, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a living room that doubled as her makeshift training space. Posters of old martial arts champions covered the walls, most of them featuring her grandfather in his prime. Moses Carter, 1997 national champion, they read, a title that had been stripped from him under circumstances her mother refused to discuss. "Imani, breakfast," her mother called from the kitchen. Across town in the affluent Riverside district, luxury cars glided through the gates of Iron Vale Academy. BMWs, Mercedes, and Teslas dropped off students dressed in pristine white GIs, their belts ranging from bright white to deep black. The academy itself was a monument to martial arts excellence: glass walls, polished floors, and equipment that gleamed under professional lighting. These students moved with the confidence of those who had never questioned their place in the world. Ryder Thompson stepped out of a midnight black Porsche, his black belt tied with military precision. At 19, he was Iron Vale's golden boy. 6 feet tall, blonde hair perfectly styled, and a record that had college scouts calling daily. Behind him emerged Lana Mitchell, her auburn hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and Kai Summers, whose muscular frame made him look older than his 17 years. They were the Academy's elite trinity, and they knew it. "Another day in paradise," Ryder said, adjusting his GI with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real adversity. Back in the Williams apartment, Imani's mother, Denise, was staring at an envelope that had arrived in yesterday's mail. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the contents for the 3rd time. "Imani, come here," she called, her voice carrying a strange mixture of excitement and confusion. Imani emerged from her room, now dressed in jeans and an old tournament t-shirt from one of her grandfather's competitions. "What is it, Mom?" Denise held up the letter, her dark eyes wide with disbelief. "It's from Iron Vale Academy. They're offering you a full scholarship." The words hit Imani like a physical blow. Iron Vale Academy was the most prestigious martial arts school in the state, the kind of place that produced Olympic hopefuls and professional fighters. It was also the kind of place that cost more per month than her mother made as a nurse's aide. "But we never applied," Imani said, taking the letter from her mother's hands. The paper was thick, expensive, with the Academy's logo embossed in gold. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made her blood run cold. "Legacy earns more than blood. What does that mean?" Denise asked, reading over her daughter's shoulder. Imani shook her head, but something deep in her gut told her this had everything to do with her grandfather. Moses Carter had attended Iron Vale decades ago, before his mysterious fall from grace. Before the accusations that had destroyed his reputation and driven him to train in underground gyms for the rest of his life. "I don't know," she lied, folding the letter carefully. "But this is my chance, Mom. This could change everything." The first day at Iron Vale Academy felt like stepping into another world. Imani stood at the entrance, Her grandfather's old gym, bag slung over her shoulder, watching as students flowed in and out of the glass doors like they owned the place. Her bus pass was still warm in her pocket, a reminder of the 3 transfers it had taken to get here from her neighborhood. The US. Lobby was all marble and chrome with trophy cases lining the walls. Photos of champions smiled down at her, their victories immortalized in gold frames. She searched the faces for any sign of her grandfather, but found nothing. It was as if Moses Carter had been erased from Iron Vale's history. "You must be our scholarship student," a voice said behind her. Imani turned to find a woman in her 40s approaching, clipboard in hand and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was tall, professionally dressed with the kind of polished appearance that screamed administration. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, the student coordinator. Welcome to Iron Vale." The smile widened, but the warmth remained absent. "Let me show you to your locker." The locker room was a testament to privilege, individual stalls with mahogany doors, heated floors, and mirrors that covered entire walls. Imani's assigned locker was in the back corner, wedged between 2 that clearly belonged to students who had been here much longer. The nameplates read, Thompson and Mitchell. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door swung open, and in walked the Trinity she had seen in the parking lot. Ryder Thompson noticed her first, his blue eyes scanning her from head to toe with the casual dismissal of someone evaluating livestock. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the practiced charm of someone used to being listened to. "You must be our charity case." Lana Mitchell elbowed him gently, though her smile held the same cold edge. "Don't be rude, Ryder. Welcome to the deep end, scholarship girl. Hope you can swim." Kai Summers said nothing, but his presence filled the space like a threat barely contained. He was the type who let his fists do the talking, and Imani could see the calculation in his eyes as he sized her up. Imani began unpacking her gear, acutely aware of how her mismatched equipment looked next to their pristine sets. Her gloves were duct-taped at the wrists, her shin guards held together with athletic tape, and her water bottle bore the faded logo of a gym that had closed 5 years ago. Each item told a story of making do, of training in basements and community centers, of a love for the art that transcended material wealth. The snickers were quiet but unmistakable. "Is that gear regulation?" Lana asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "It's what I have," Imani replied simply, refusing to let shame creep into her voice. Ryder leaned against his locker, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "Well, at least you'll stand out. Nothing like mismatched gear to make a first impression." The main training floor was massive, with 8 separate mat areas and enough space for 100 students to train simultaneously. Professional-grade lighting eliminated every shadow, and the walls were lined with weapons, training dummies, and enough equipment to stock 3 normal gyms. Coach Renshaw stood at the center of it all like a general surveying his army. He was in his 50s, built like a former heavyweight fighter, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. When those eyes fell on Imani, she felt stripped bare, analyzed, and filed away in some mental database. "So you're Williams," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been questioned. "Moses Carter's granddaughter." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Every conversation in the immediate vicinity stopped, and Imani felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes settling on her shoulders. "Yes, sir," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Renshaw nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Carter was memorable. Let's see if talent runs in the family. Beside him, Assistant Coach Mendez, a younger man with kind eyes and nervous energy, stepped forward. "Welcome to Iron Vale, Imani. We're glad to have you here." His warmth was genuine, and Imani felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. At least one person in this place seemed to see her as more than an inconvenience. The first class began with basic drills, movements that Imani had been practicing since she could walk. But here, everything was different. The rhythm was foreign, the techniques modified from what her grandfather had taught her in their makeshift dojo at home. She found herself constantly a half beat behind, her body wanting to flow where the instruction demanded rigidity. "Partner up for sparring drills," Coach Renshaw called out. Imani found herself paired with Trent Morrison, an orange belt with the cocky swagger of someone who had never faced real adversity. He was 17, well-fed, and clearly expected this to be an easy victory over the new girl with the second-hand gear. "Don't worry," he said with condescending kindness. "I'll go easy on you." The words sparked something in Imani's chest, not anger, but recognition. She had heard variations of that phrase her entire life, from teachers who expected less, from opponents who underestimated her, from a world that saw a young black girl from a poor neighborhood and immediately lowered its expectations. The drill began with basic grappling, but Trent immediately tried to overpower her with brute strength. He was bigger, stronger, and more experienced with Iron Veil's specific techniques. But he had never trained with Moses Carter, had never learned to read an opponent's breathing, had never been taught to use momentum as a weapon. When Trent rushed forward for what should have been an easy takedown, Imani shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. His momentum carried him past her, and she used his own force to guide him to the mat. Before he could react, she had secured a position that would have led to a submission in a real match. The gymnasium fell silent. Even Coach Renshaw paused in his instruction, his eyes fixed on the two students on the mat. What he had just witnessed wasn't luck or beginner's fortune, it was technique. Old technique. The kind that hadn't been taught at Iron Veil in decades. "Interesting," Renshaw murmured, though whether he was pleased or concerned was impossible to tell. Trent scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Lucky shot," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. That evening, Imani sat in what had once been her grandfather's bedroom, but now served as her private training space. The walls were covered with photos from Moses Carter's fighting career. Images of him in his prime, locked in combat with opponents whose names had become legend. In the center of it all hung his most prized possession, a medal from the 1997 National Championships, the one they had tried to take from him. She held the medal, now feeling its weight in her palm. The inscription read, "Champion," in bold letters, but someone had scratched a line through it years ago. The scar in the medal served as a constant reminder of how quickly glory could be stripped away. "They'll always see you as less," she whispered, repeating words her grandfather had spoken to her countless times. "Until you teach them to see differently." The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the old gym, could almost feel his weathered hands adjusting her stance. Moses Carter had been many things, a champion, a teacher, a man who had fallen from grace, but he had never been a quitter. Even when the accusations came, even when his reputation crumbled, he had continued training, continued believing that the truth would eventually surface. A sound from the doorway made her look up. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing there, tall, wearing the gray uniform of a maintenance worker. But when she blinked, the doorway was empty. Back at Iron Veil, the elite students had gathered in the academy's private study room, a space reserved for black belts and those destined for greatness. Ryder sat at the head of the polished conference table, his feet propped up with casual arrogance. Lana and Kai flanked him, their expressions ranging from amused to predatory. "Did you see her gear?" Lana said, scrolling through social media on her phone. "I felt embarrassed for her." "The gear doesn't matter," Kai said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Did you see that move she pulled on Trent?" Ryder waved dismissively. "One lucky technique doesn't make her a threat. She's nobody special, just another charity case trying to prove she belongs." But Lana wasn't so sure. Something about the way Imani had moved nagged at her, like a song she couldn't quite remember. The technique had been fluid, almost dance-like, completely different from Iron Veil's rigid methodology. She had seen something similar before, in old tournament footage she had studied for technique analysis. "What if she's not nobody?" Lana asked quietly. Ryder fixed her with a stare that could have frozen water. "Then we make sure she becomes nobody. This is our house, our rules. Some scholarship kid isn't going to change that." Meanwhile, in the depths of Iron Veil Academy, an old man pushed a janitor's cart through the empty hallways. Mr. Benson had worked at the academy for 15 years, invisible to the students and staff who saw only his uniform. But his eyes missed nothing. and what he had witnessed today had stirred memories he had tried to bury. He paused outside the gymnasium, remembering another student who had moved with that same fluid grace decades ago. Moses Carter had been different too, had carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that real strength came from within. And like Moses, this girl was about to discover that Iron Veil Academy had its own way of dealing with those who didn't fit the mold. Carter's girl, he murmured to himself, shaking his head. Just like him. The words echoed in the empty hallway, carrying with them the weight of history and the promise of conflict to come. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray sky that promised rain but never delivered. Imani walked through Iron Veil's gleaming hallways with the cautious awareness of someone who sensed they were being watched. After yesterday's unexpected success in sparring, she could feel the shift in atmosphere around her. Conversations. That stopped when she approached. Glances that lingered a moment too long. Smiles that didn't reach their owner's eyes. Her locker stood open, just as she had left it the night before. But something was wrong. The familiar weight of her water bottle felt different in her hands, and when she unscrewed the cap, the sharp chemical smell that hit her nostrils made her recoil instantly. Bleach. Someone had filled her water bottle with bleach. Imani looked around the locker room, searching for any sign of who might have done this. A few students were changing nearby, but their conversations continued without pause, their expressions innocent of any wrongdoing. No one acknowledged what had happened. No one offered help. The message was clear. She was alone in this place. "Everything okay?" asked a voice behind her. Imani turned to find Jonas Webb approaching, his brown hair disheveled, and his white belt tied with the careful precision of someone still learning the proper knots. He was probably 16, tall and lanky in the way of teenagers who hadn't quite grown into their frames, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Someone thought it would be funny to season my water," Imani said, holding up the bottle so he could smell the chemical tang. Jonas's face darkened with genuine anger. "That's messed up. You should report it." "To who? You think anyone here cares what happens to the scholarship kid?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jonas looked around the locker room, taking in the studied indifference of the other students, and seemed to understand exactly what kind of environment Imani had walked into. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I guess you're right." As Imani dumped the contaminated water down the drain, her mind drifted back 20 years to a different time, a different place. She was 7 years old again, standing in the basement of her grandfather's house, which he had converted into a makeshift dojo. The concrete floor was covered with puzzle piece mats that didn't quite fit together, and the walls were lined with mirrors salvaged from a demolished dance studio. "Balance, little warrior," Moses Carter said, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching. Fighting isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being where your opponent doesn't expect you to be. Young Imani circled him on the mat, her movements careful and deliberate. Even at 7, she moved with an unusual grace, her body seeming to flow from position to position without the choppy transition that marked most beginners. "They're going to try to put you in a box," Moses continued, his weathered hands moving, in slow hypnotic patterns that she mirrored instinctively. "Tell you how you should move, how you should think, who you should be, but water doesn't fit in boxes, does it?" "No, Grandpa." "That's right. Water finds the cracks, the spaces others can't see. It doesn't fight the rock, it wears it down. Remember that when the world tries to make you hard." The memory faded as Imani returned to the present, but the lesson remained. She wouldn't let Iron Veil's toxic culture poison her the way someone had tried to poison her water. She would be water, persistent, adaptable, unstoppable. Jonas was still watching her with concern. "Look, I know I'm just a white belt and you probably don't need advice from me, but..." He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "The black belts here, they protect their territory. They don't like outsiders, especially ones who show them up in front of the coaches." "Is that a warning?" "It's a heads up. Ryder, Lana, and Kai, they've got reputations to protect. Scholarships, sponsorships, college offers. Someone like you coming in here and showing skills they didn't expect. It makes them nervous." Imani appreciated his honesty, even if she didn't need it. She had grown up understanding that she would have to work twice as hard for half the recognition, that every opportunity would come with a price attached. Iron Vale was just another battlefield in a war she had been fighting her entire life. That evening, as Imani sat at the kitchen table, working on homework, her mother approached with the worried expression she had worn since the scholarship letter arrived. "Baby, maybe we should think about this more carefully," Denise said, settling into the chair across from her daughter. "That school, those people, they're not like us." "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know what I mean. Rich kids, rich families. They play by different rules, and when someone like you starts winning, they change the game." Imani looked up from her textbook, studying her mother's face. Denise Williams had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat after Moses died, had sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities she had never had. But there was something else in her expression now, fear that went deeper than simple concern for her daughter's well-being. "Mom, what aren't you telling me about Grandpa? About what really happened to him?" Denise's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "Your grandfather was a proud man. Sometimes pride makes people do things they shouldn't do, say things they shouldn't say. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." Denise's voice carried a finality that shut down further conversation. "Just be careful, Imani. We don't need to fight anymore. That life ended with your grandfather." But Imani wasn't sure she had a choice in the matter. The next day's training session brought a new challenge. Coach Renshaw announced a power shift drill, a rotating sparring exercise where each student would face multiple opponents in succession. It was designed to test adaptability and endurance, but Imani suspected it was really designed to put her in her place. "Williams," Renshaw called out, his voice carrying across the gymnasium. "You're up first. Kai, you're her partner." Kai Summers stepped onto the mat with the confidence of someone who had never lost a match that mattered. He was bigger than Imani, stronger, and had been training at Iron Vale since he was 12. His parents owned a chain of sporting goods stores and had been generous donors to the Academy's expansion fund. In other words, he was exactly the kind of student Iron Vale was designed to produce. "Don't take this personally," he said as they touched gloves, but his smile suggested he very much wanted her to take it personally. The match began with Kai attempting to use his size advantage to control the pace. He pressed forward aggressively, trying to back Imani against the edge of the mat where his reach would give him an even greater advantage. It was a sound strategy against most opponents, overwhelming them with power and leaving them no room to maneuver. But Imani had learned to fight in spaces much smaller than this, against men much larger than Kai. Her grandfather's basement dojo had been cramped and crowded with equipment, forcing her to develop a style that relied on economy of movement rather than wide, sweeping techniques. As Kai rushed forward for what should have been a decisive takedown, Imani shifted her weight and used his momentum against him. But this wasn't the simple redirect she had used against Trent. This was something more sophisticated, a technique that seemed to bend the laws of physics by turning Kai's strength into a weakness. She trapped his arm in an improvised hold that shouldn't have been possible given their size difference, applying pressure to a nerve cluster that most students wouldn't learn about until they reached advanced brown belt level. Kai found himself immobilized, his face contorting in surprise and pain. The gymnasium fell silent. Even the coaches stopped their conversations to stare at the 2 figures on the mat. What Imani had just demonstrated wasn't part of Iron Vale's curriculum, wasn't something that could be learned from textbooks or video tutorials. It was old knowledge, the kind passed down through generations of fighters who understood that technique could overcome raw power. "Where did you learn that?" Coach Renshaw asked, his voice sharp with something that might have been suspicion. "My grandfather taught me," Imani replied simply, releasing the hold and helping Kai to his feet. Renshaw's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Your grandfather taught you a lot of things, apparently." The words carried an undertone that made the hair on the back of Imani's neck stand up. There was history there, old wounds that hadn't fully healed. But before she could ask what he meant, Renshaw had already moved on to the next pair of students. The victory over Kai should have earned her respect, but instead, it painted an even larger target on her back. By the end of the day, Imani's locker contained 2 more threatening notes. Get out before you get broken, and some lessons hurt more than others. She was crumpling up the second note when a shadow fell across her locker. Mr. Benson stood there, his janitor's cart parked nearby, holding something in his weathered hands. Without a word, he handed her a folded piece of paper and walked away. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and bore the header of a martial arts tournament from 1997. At the center of the flyer, in bold black letters, was her grandfather's name, Moses Carter, champion. But it was the symbol at the bottom that caught her attention. A stylized iron fist surrounded by flames, the same symbol she had noticed etched into various places around the academy. That evening, Imani found herself drawn back to Iron Vale after hours. She used the keycard from her scholarship packet to enter through the side door, moving through the darkened hallways with the stealth her grandfather had taught her. The building felt different in the darkness, less polished, more honest somehow, as if the shadows revealed truths that the fluorescent lights had hidden. The symbol on the tournament flyer led her to the basement levels, areas of the academy that most students never saw. Down here, the walls were older, the construction less refined. It was as if Iron Vale had been built on top of something else, something from an earlier era. She found the door behind a stack of old exercise equipment, heavy iron painted black, with the same flame-wreathed fist symbol carved into its surface. The lock was old but well-maintained, and her scholarship keycard shouldn't have worked on it. But somehow it did. The room beyond was like stepping back in time. This wasn't the sleek, modern facility upstairs. This was a real dojo, the kind where fighters went to test themselves against something more than technique and form. The mats were worn smooth by decades of use, the walls lined with equipment that had been built to last rather than impress. Faded posters covered every available surface, showing fighters from an era when the sport was grittier, more honest. And there, hanging from the ceiling like a battle standard, was a torn banner that read, "Carter's Way." Imani knelt in the center of the room, running her hands over the ancient mats. This was where her grandfather had trained, where he had developed the techniques she carried in her blood. This was the foundation upon which Iron Vale Academy had been built, the history they had tried to erase. But history had a way of refusing to stay buried. As she began to move through the forms Moses had taught her, her movements flowing like water in the dimly lit space, Imani felt a presence watching from the shadows. She didn't turn to look, didn't acknowledge the observer, but she knew with absolute certainty that someone was there. Someone who remembered the old ways, the old fighters, the old truths that Iron Vale's glossy surface was designed to hide. Someone who had been waiting for Moses Carter's granddaughter to find her way home. The discovery of the Red Room changed everything for Imani. She began returning each night after the academy officially closed, using her key card to slip through the darkened hallways like a ghost. In that forgotten basement dojo surrounded by the echoes of her grandfather's legacy, she began to rediscover the true depth of what Moses Carter had taught her. The techniques came back in fragments, muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. Her grandfather's approach to martial arts had been unconventional, treating combat like a conversation between bodies rather than a clash of wills. Where Iron Vale taught rigid structure and overwhelming force, Moses had emphasized flow, deception, and emotional control. "Fighting isn't about anger," she whispered, repeating his words as she moved through the forms. "Anger makes you predictable. Water isn't angry when it carves through stone. It's patient." The Red Room became her sanctuary, the one place in Iron Vale where she could train without judgment or interference. The old equipment responded to her touch like instruments waiting for the right musician. Heavy bags that had absorbed decades of punishment, grappling dummies worn smooth by countless training sessions, mirrors that had reflected the movements of champions long forgotten by the Academy's official history. She wasn't always alone. Mr. Benson appeared periodically, materializing from the shadows with the quiet grace of someone who had spent years moving unseen through the world. He never spoke directly about her training, but his presence served as a form of coaching, a nod when she executed a technique correctly, a subtle shake of the head when she relied too heavily on strength instead of leverage. "The black belts aren't just fighters," he said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're walls, Solid, immovable, convinced of their own strength. You need to be water. His words echoed her grandfather's teaching so perfectly that she wondered if the two men had known each other. But when she asked, Benson simply smiled and faded back into the shadows, leaving her with more questions than answers. Hidden throughout the Red Room, Imani discovered remnants of her grandfather's time at Iron Vale. VHS tapes labeled with dates from the 1990s, their cases cracked with age. She found an old television and VCR buried under a tarp, probably forgotten when the Academy upgraded to digital systems. The first tape she played showed a tournament match from 1997, the year of her grandfather's championship. On the grainy footage, Moses Carter moved like liquid lightning. His opponent was bigger, stronger, more aggressive, but Moses seemed to anticipate every attack before it began. The technique that won him the match was the same one Imani had instinctively used against Kai, the nerve cluster hold that had shocked even Coach Renshaw. "How did I know that?" she murmured, rewinding the tape to watch the sequence again. The movement was too complex, too precise to be coincidence. It was as if Moses's knowledge lived in her bones, waiting for the right moment to surface. Upstairs, in the world of polished floors and gleaming trophies, her presence continued to disrupt the established order. Lana Mitchell had begun following her with increasing frequency, though she tried to be subtle about it. During classes, between training sessions, even in the locker room, Lana's eyes tracked Imani's movements with the intensity of someone studying a particularly interesting puzzle. It was during one of these surveillance sessions that Lana captured something unexpected. Hidden behind a pillar, she recorded Imani practicing alone after hours, her phone camera catching the fluid grace of movements that definitely weren't part of Iron Vale's curriculum. But when Lana reviewed the footage later, she made a crucial edit, cropping out the context, adjusting the angles to make it appear as if Imani was breaking into restricted areas rather than training with obvious permission. "This could be useful," she murmured, uploading the manipulated video to her private cloud storage. The confrontation Imani had been expecting finally came during a particularly intense training session. Coach Renshaw called her aside, his expression unreadable as he led her to his private office. The space was a shrine to martial arts achievement, walls covered with certificates, photos of champions, and enough trophies to stock a sporting goods store. "Sit," Renshaw commanded, settling behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. Imani remained standing. "Is there a problem, Coach?" "That depends on your definition of problem." His fingers drummed against the desktop, a nervous habit that seemed at odds with his usual composure. "That technique you used against Kai, the nerve compression hold. Where exactly did you learn it?" "I told you. My grandfather taught me." "Moses Carter taught you a lot of things, apparently. Things that aren't part of any standard curriculum." Renshaw leaned forward, his eyes sharp with something that might have been suspicion or fear. "Tell me, Miss Williams, what else did your grandfather share with you about his time at Iron Vale?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Imani understood intuitively that her answer would determine how the rest of her time at the academy would unfold. Too much honesty might reveal secrets she wasn't ready to expose. Too little might convince Renshaw that she knew more than she was saying. "He didn't talk much about the past," she said carefully. "He was more focused on teaching me to be better than I was yesterday." Renshaw studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if accepting her answer while clearly not believing it. "Well, yesterday's techniques won't serve you well in today's competitions. I'd suggest focusing on what we teach here, rather than dwelling on outdated methods." The dismissal was clear, but as Imani turned to leave, Renshaw's voice stopped her. "Oh, and Miss Williams? The Academy has security cameras throughout the building. Just something to keep in mind during your evening studies." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Renshaw knew about her late-night training sessions, which meant he probably knew about the Red Room. But if he wanted to stop her, why hadn't he simply revoked her access? What was he waiting for? That evening, as Imani made her way to the basement, she was surprised to find someone waiting for her in the Red Room. A figure sat cross-legged in the center of the old mats, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured their features. For a moment she thought it might be Mr. Benson, but something about the posture was wrong. "You move like him?" the figure said without looking up. The voice was young, male, with an accent that suggested years of careful education. "Moses Carter. I've seen the tapes." The stranger stood, pulling back his hood to reveal a face Imani recognized from academy photos. This was Kai's older brother, Elijah Summers, supposedly expelled 3 years ago for academic misconduct. He was older than Kai, probably 22 or 23, with the same muscular build but different eyes. Where Kai's gaze held casual cruelty, Elijah's eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much too young. "You're supposed to be gone," Imani said, not moving closer but not backing away either. "I am gone. Officially. But some of us find it hard to stay away from places that shaped us." He gestured to the old equipment surrounding them. "This room, this history. It's what Iron Veil used to be before it became a factory for producing obedient champions. What do you want?" "To warn you, and to apologize for what's coming." Elijah's expression grew serious. "They're going to force you into a situation where you'll have to choose between your principles and your place here. When that happens, remember that some battles are worth losing if they expose the right truths." Before Imani could ask what he meant, footsteps echoed in the hallway above. Elijah melted back into the shadows with practiced ease, leaving her alone with questions that multiplied like fractures in glass. The next morning brought news that shifted the academy's entire dynamic. Posted on the main bulletin board, written in Ryder Thompson's precise handwriting, was a challenge that made every student stop and stare. Iron Veil Gauntlet Challenge. Imani Williams versus 5 opponents. Thursday evening, after regular classes. Fighters to be selected by academy leadership. Rules. Traditional Iron Veil regulations. No rest between matches. Victory by submission or forfeit only. The gauntlet was a brutal tradition, supposedly discontinued years ago due to safety concerns. It was designed to test not just skill, but endurance, mental toughness, and the kind of warrior spirit that Iron Veil claimed to value above all else. In practice, it was a hazing ritual disguised as honor combat, a way for the established hierarchy to put upstarts in their place. "You don't have to accept," Jonas said, finding Imani during lunch break. His usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by genuine concern. "Everyone would understand if you walked away from this." "Would they?" Imani asked, watching as groups of students whispered and pointed in her direction. "Or would they just confirm what they already believe, that I don't belong here?" The truth was, she had been expecting something like this since her first day. Ryder's ego couldn't tolerate being shown up by a scholarship student, and the academy's AUKA culture demanded that challenges be answered with overwhelming force. If she refused, she would be branded a coward. If she accepted and lost, she would be humiliated. If she accepted and won, well, that might be even more dangerous. "The gauntlet hasn't been used in 3 years, Jonas continued. "Last time, a kid ended up in the hospital. His parents sued, and the academy promised it would never happen again." "Then why is Coach Renshaw allowing it now?" Jonas didn't have an answer for that, but Imani suspected she knew. Renshaw was using Ryder to do what he couldn't do directly, eliminate a problem that threatened the academy's carefully maintained order. That afternoon, assistant coach Mendez pulled her aside after class. His usually kind eyes were troubled, and he kept glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "This challenge," he said quietly, "it's not what it seems. Renshaw is using you to send a message to anyone else who might think about rocking the boat. So you think I should refuse? I think you should be very careful about who you trust." Mendez lowered his voice even further. "There are things about this academy, about what happened to your grandfather that you need to know, but not here, not now." Before Imani could press for details, Renshaw's voice boomed across the gymnasium. "Mendez, is there a problem with our scholarship student?" "No problem, coach," Mendez replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Just discussing proper preparation for tomorrow's challenge." Renshaw approached with the measured stride of a predator circling wounded prey. Good. Miss Williams, I trust you understand the honor you've been given. The gauntlet is reserved for our most promising students. I understand perfectly, Imani replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. Excellent. Then you'll be pleased to know we've selected your opponents carefully. Each one represents a different aspect of Iron Veil's fighting philosophy. Consider it educational. That evening, Imani intensified her training in the Red Room. She moved through her grandfather's forms with desperate precision, trying to absorb decades of knowledge in a single night. The old techniques felt more natural now, as if her body was remembering skills it had always possessed. She was practicing a complex transition when she realized she wasn't alone. Mr. Benson stood in the doorway, but this time he wasn't hiding in the shadows. He stepped into the light, and for the first time Imani could see him clearly. Weathered face marked by old scars, eyes that held the weight of secrets too dangerous to share. "You're Moses's girl, all right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Got his stubbornness, his pride, his refusal to back down from a fight worth fighting." "Tell me about him," Imani said, pausing in her training. "Tell me what really happened." Benson was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if looking for traces of the man he had once known. "Your grandfather was the best fighter this academy ever produced. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but the smartest. He understood that real combat isn't about following rules. It's about adapting to whatever your opponent brings." "Then why did they destroy him?" "Because he asked the wrong questions. About matches that ended strangely. About judges who made questionable calls. About money that changed hands when it shouldn't have." Benson's expression darkened. Moses Carter had one fatal flaw. He believed that truth mattered more than politics. Tatars, night before the gauntlet arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather itself was anticipating the heat of combat to come. Imani spent the evening in the Red Room, but instead of intense training, she sat quietly in the center of the old mats, letting her grandfather's presence settle around her like armor. She had found additional tapes hidden behind the old equipment, recordings of Moses training alone, working through the same techniques she had been practicing. Watching him move was like seeing her own reflection across time, the same fluid grace, the same instinctive understanding of leverage and timing. "Tomorrow, they'll try to break you," she whispered to the empty room, echoing words Moses had spoken in one of the recordings. "But you can't break water. You can only redirect it." The gauntlet was scheduled for 7 p.m., after regular classes ended and most of the younger students had gone home. But word had spread, and by 6:30, the main gymnasium was packed with spectators, academy alumni, advanced students. Even some parents had gathered to witness what many expected to be a systematic dismantling of the scholarship student who had dared to challenge Iron Veil's established order. Ryder stood at the center of it, all playing the role of gracious host while his eyes held the cold satisfaction of someone about to watch an enemy destroyed. He had chosen the 5 opponents carefully, each one designed to exploit a different weakness or push Imani past her breaking point. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the crowded gymnasium. "Tonight, we witness the revival of an Iron Veil tradition, the Gauntlet Challenge. 5 fighters, no rest, victory by submission or forfeit only." Coach Renshaw watched from the sidelines, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture tense with anticipation. Assistant Coach Mendez stood nearby, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The first opponent stepped onto the mat, Trent Morrison, the orange belt who had underestimated Imani on her first day. He was bigger now, more confident, fueled by the memory of his earlier humiliation and the knowledge that he had 4 allies waiting in the wings. "Round 1 begins. Now!" Renshaw called out. Trent rushed forward immediately, trying to use his size advantage to overwhelm Imani before she could establish her rhythm, but she had learned from their previous encounter, had studied the patterns of his aggression in the weeks since. Where before she had simply redirected his momentum, now she actively used it against him. The match lasted less than 2 minutes. Imani caught Trent in a modified arm lock that forced him to tap out or risk serious injury. The crowd's reaction was muted, surprise mixed with the growing realization that this might not be the one-sided beatdown they had expected. "Round 2, Renshaw announced without pause. Violet Chang entered the mat with the precise movements of someone who treated martial arts like mathematics. She was a brown belt, technically perfect, known for her ability to counter any technique with textbook precision. If Trent represented brute force, Violet embodied pure technical skill. The second match was a chess game played at fighting speed. Violet anticipated Imani's unconventional techniques and responded with classical counters, forcing longer exchanges that tested both fighters' endurance. But Moses Carter's training had emphasized adaptation above all else, and Imani began varying her style mid-technique, shifting from her grandfather's flowing approach to Iron Veil's rigid structure, and back again. The combination confused Violet's classical responses, creating openings that shouldn't have existed. When Imani finally secured the winning submission, a shoulder lock that Moses had perfected decades earlier, she could feel the crowd's energy shift from anticipation to uncertainty. "Round 3, Renshaw called, his voice slightly strained. Kai Summers approached the mat with grim determination, his usual swagger replaced by focused intensity. This was personal for him, revenge for the humiliation Imani had dealt him in front of Coach Renshaw and the entire class. He was bigger, stronger, and more experienced, but more importantly, he was angry. The third match was brutal. Kai targeted Imani's shoulder from the opening seconds, using his weight advantage to grind her down through sustained pressure. Every technique she attempted, he countered with pure aggression, turning the contest into a test of endurance rather than skill. Imani's shoulder began to burn, then ache, then scream with each movement. She could feel the joint loosening under Kai's relentless assault, could sense the crowd's growing excitement as they smelled blood in the water. This was what they had come to see. The scholarship student broken down, piece by piece, until she had no choice but to quit. But just when it seemed she would have to forfeit, Imani remembered Lana's whispered tip from weeks earlier. Kai's weak right knee, injured in a skiing accident the previous winter. As he pressed his attack favoring his strong left side, she shifted her weight and swept the compromised joint with surgical precision. Kai went down hard, and Imani secured a submission hold before he could recover. The crowd fell silent, the implications of what they were witnessing finally sinking in. This wasn't going according to script. "Round 4, Renshaw announced, but his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. The fourth opponent shocked everyone, including Imani. Jonas Webb stepped onto the mat, his face pale with anguish, his movements reluctant, and apologetic. "I'm sorry," he whispered as they touched gloves. "They said if I didn't fight, they'd make sure I never got my black belt. My scholarship depends on it." Imani understood immediately. Jonas was being used as a weapon against her. His friendship turned into another form of torture. The cruelest part wasn't that she had to fight him, it was that she had to choose between her own advancement and his future. The match began with both fighters holding back, neither wanting to hurt someone they cared about. But the crowd grew, restless, and Renshaw's voice cut through the gymnasium like a blade. "This is combat, not a dance recital. Fight or forfeit." Jonas threw a half-hearted combination that Imani could have easily countered into a submission. Instead, she let him connect, taking the hit and stumbling backward as if it had more impact than it did. The crowd roared its approval, and she signaled her forfeit. "Round 5, Renshaw called, his satisfaction evident. Lana Mitchell entered the mat with conflicted emotions written across her face. She had been watching Imani's performance with growing admiration, recognizing in the scholarship student something she had been missing in her own training: authenticity. Iron Veil had taught her to fight by the numbers, to follow formulas, and execute techniques with mechanical precision. But Imani fought with heart, with instinct, with the kind of flowing creativity that couldn't be learned from textbooks. The final match began with both fighters testing each other, feeling for weaknesses and openings. Lana was technically superior, her years of Iron Veil training evident in every movement. But she was also wrestling with doubts that had been building for weeks, doubts about the Academy's methods, about her own motivations, about the kind of fighter she wanted to become. When Imani finally caught her in a submission hold, a triangle choke that tightened gradually, rather than explosively, Lana had a choice to make. She could fight it, possibly break free, certainly make Imani work harder for the victory, or she could accept what was happening and choose a different path forward. "I'm done with them," she whispered, just loud enough for Imani to hear. The tap-out sent shockwaves through the crowd. Lana Mitchell, daughter of Academy donors, future collegiate champion, had just surrendered to a scholarship student who had been training at Iron Vale for barely a month. Imani stood in the center of the mat, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat, barely able to remain upright. She had won 4 matches and forfeited 1, which should have been enough to complete the gauntlet with honor intact. But as the crowd began to disperse, Ryder Thompson's voice echoed across the gymnasium. "Not quite finished yet," he said, stepping onto the mat with the cold smile of someone who had saved the best for last. "The gauntlet traditionally ends with the challenger facing the Academy's top student. That would be me." Imani looked to Coach Renshaw for confirmation, but his expression offered no relief. This had been planned from the beginning. 5 opponents to weaken her, then Ryder to deliver the final humiliation. "I can barely stand," she said, not as a complaint but as a simple statement of fact. "Then you should have thought of that before." "Embarrassing my academy," Ryder replied, his voice carrying across the now silent gymnasium. "Time to learn what real Iron Vale fighting looks like." The gymnasium had fallen into an almost religious silence as Ryder Thompson stepped onto the mat. Even in her exhausted state, Imani could feel the shift in energy. This wasn't just another match in the gauntlet. This was personal, a reckoning that had been building since her first day at Iron Vale Academy. Ryder moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never truly been tested. His record was spotless, his technique flawless, his reputation built on a foundation of victories against carefully selected opponents. He was everything Iron Vale wanted its champions to be: strong, composed, and absolutely certain of his own superiority. "You shouldn't have made it this far," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for the spectators to hear. "You embarrassed my academy, questioned our methods, and disrespected everything we've built here. Time to correct that mistake." Imani's shoulders screamed with each movement. Her legs felt like they were made of concrete, and her vision blurred, slightly around the edges from exhaustion. Any rational person would have forfeited, accepted defeat with dignity, and lived to fight another day. But rationality had never been her strong suit, and something deeper than pride kept her standing. "Your academy?" she asked, finding her voice despite the fatigue. "Funny. I thought it belonged to everyone who earned their place here." The comment drew murmurs from the crowd, but Ryder's expression didn't change. He had moved beyond anger into something colder, more calculated. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about power, about maintaining the natural order that kept people like him on top and people like her on the bottom. Coach Renshaw stepped forward to officiate, his eyes holding a gleam that suggested he was looking forward to what came next. "Standard Iron Vale rules. Victory by submission, unconsciousness, or forfeit. Begin." The match started with Ryder pressing his advantage immediately. He was fresh, she was broken down, and he intended to make the most of that disparity. His first combination was textbook perfect, a series of strikes designed to back her against the edge of the mat where his reach would give him an even greater advantage. But Imani had learned something in her grandfather's red room, that Iron Vale's pristine facilities couldn't teach how to fight when everything was going wrong. Moses Carter had trained in basement gyms and back alley dojos, places where pretty technique mattered less than the ability to survive and adapt. As Ryder's attack came forward like a sledgehammer, Imani moved like smoke. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, calm and steady despite the chaos around her. "When the mountain comes to you, little warrior, you don't stand in its path. You become the valley that guides it where you want it to go." She redirected Ryder's momentum rather than opposing it, using his own force to create openings that his aggressive style couldn't protect. For the first time in the match, she managed to secure a brief grappling exchange, though her weakened condition prevented her from capitalizing on it. "Impressive," Ryder admitted, resetting his position with the casual arrogance of someone who wasn't worried about the outcome. But tricks won't save you forever. The second exchange was more brutal. Ryder targeted her injured shoulder with surgical precision, using his superior conditioning to grind her down through sustained pressure. Every technique she attempted, he countered with pure aggression, turning their contest into a war of attrition that heavily favored the fighter who wasn't bleeding from multiple wounds. Imani found herself on the defensive, barely able to prevent Ryder from securing a fight-ending submission. The crowd's energy shifted again, sensing the inevitable conclusion. This was what they had come to see. Order restored, hierarchy maintained, the upstart put firmly in her place. But in that moment of near defeat, something clicked in Imani's mind. She stopped thinking about winning and started thinking about surviving. More importantly, she stopped fighting Ryder's fight and started fighting her own. The transition was so subtle that most spectators missed it entirely. Imani's movements became less desperate, more calculated. She wasn't trying to match Ryder's strength anymore. She was reading his patterns, learning his preferences, mapping the invisible landscape of his fighting style. Moses Carter had taught her that every fighter had a signature, a rhythm as unique as a fingerprint. Ryder's signature was overwhelming aggression backed by technical precision, but like all signatures, it could be forged by someone who understood its component parts. When Ryder pressed forward for what should have been the finishing combination, Imani was ready. She flowed around his attack like water around a stone, using his momentum to create an opening that existed for perhaps half a second. But half a second was enough. The triangle choke that followed was a thing of beauty, not because of its technical perfection, but because of its perfect timing. It was the same technique Moses Carter had used to win his final legitimate match, before the accusations and the fall from grace. The same technique that had been branded cheating by people who couldn't understand how someone could make the impossible look effortless. Ryder fought the submission with everything he had, his face reddening as the choke tightened. The crowd was on its feet now, the outcome suddenly uncertain. For 30 seconds, then 45, then a full minute, he refused to tap out, his pride preventing him from acknowledging defeat. Finally, inevitably, his body made the choice his mind couldn't. Ryder went limp, unconscious but not permanently harmed, his undefeated record shattered by a scholarship student who should never have belonged in the same ring with him. The gymnasium erupted in chaos. Some spectators cheered, others argued, and a few simply stared in stunned silence at what they had just witnessed. But before anyone could properly process the victory, Coach Renshaw's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Technical irregularities in the final sequence," he announced, his tone carrying the absolute authority of someone who had never been questioned. "The match is ruled a draw pending further review." The words hit Imani like a physical blow. She had done everything asked of her, had defeated 5 opponents and then their champion, had proven beyond any doubt that she belonged at Iron Vale Academy. And still it wasn't enough. Still, they found a way to deny her the victory she had earned, with blood and determination. "That's garbage!" Jonas shouted from the crowd, his voice cracking with indignation. "She won fair and square." Others began to voice similar protests, but Renshaw's glare silenced them with practiced efficiency. In his world, the coach's word was law, and anyone who questioned that authority did so at their own peril. Imani stood in the center of the mat, swaying slightly from exhaustion and pain, but her eyes were clear and focused. She looked directly at Renshaw, then at the crowd, then back at the unconscious form of Ryder Thompson. "I know what I did," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying to every corner of the silent gymnasium. "And so do all of you." The victory had been stolen from her, but the performance couldn't be erased. Everyone present had seen a scholarship student from the wrong side of town defeat Iron Vale's finest. The Academy's carefully maintained mythology had been shattered, and no amount of official rhetoric could put it back together. As the crowd began to disperse, many of the students approached Imani with congratulations and expressions of support. For the first time since arriving at Iron Vale, she felt like she belonged somewhere, accepted by people who had witnessed her prove herself under impossible circumstances. But the celebration was short-lived. Later that night, As Imani made her way to the Red Room for what had become her nightly ritual, she discovered that someone had been there before her. The old training equipment was overturned, the VHS tapes scattered and broken, the mirrors cracked into spiderwebs of reflected light. On the wall where the Carter's Way banner had hung, someone had spray-painted a simple message. "You were warned. Walk away, or history will repeat." The days following the gauntlet brought an unsettling calm to Iron Vale Academy. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Classes continued, students trained, coaches maintained their authority. But underneath the polished veneer, something fundamental had shifted. Word of Imani's performance had spread beyond the academy, walls drawing attention from people who preferred to operate in the shadows. Jonas found Imani during lunch break, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by nervous energy. He kept glancing around as if expecting to be overheard, his food untouched on the tray before him. "There's something you need to know," he said quietly, "about how things really work here." Imani looked up from her own barely touched meal. The events of the past week had left her drained, physically and emotionally. Her shoulders still ached from Kai's assault, and the destruction of the Red Room felt like a personal violation. "I'm listening." Jonas leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's a group here. They call themselves the Brotherhood. It's not official, not written down anywhere, but they control everything that matters. Scholarships, sponsorships, tournament selections, even some of the judging. Who's involved? Renshaw, obviously. Some of the board members. A few alumni who donate big money." Jonas paused, struggling with what to say next. "And students. The ones who prove they're willing to play the game, to protect the academy's interests even when it means doing things that aren't exactly legal." The implications hit Imani like a cold wave. Everything she had experienced, the sabotage, the threats, the biased officiating, wasn't random harassment by jealous students. It was systematic, organized, designed to maintain a power structure that benefited the connected few at the expense of everyone else. "How do you know all this?" Jonas's expression grew haunted. "Because they tried to recruit me. After I helped you with the kids' self-defense classes, after I stood up for you during the gauntlet. They said I showed the right kind of loyalty, that there were opportunities for people who understood how to be team players." "What did you tell them?" "That I needed time to think about it." He looked directly at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. "But I've already decided. Whatever they're offering, it's not worth becoming the kind of person who destroys people like you for asking inconvenient questions." Their conversation was interrupted by Lana Mitchell approaching their table. Since her decision to forfeit during the gauntlet, she had been treated as a pariah by her former friends, though she seemed oddly relieved by the isolation. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, not waiting for an answer before sliding into the empty chair beside Jonas. Imani studied her carefully. Trust didn't come easily in a place where loyalty could be bought and friendships weaponized, but something in Lana's demeanor suggested genuine remorse for her previous actions. "I owe you an explanation," Lana said, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the confession. "About the surveillance, the manipulated footage, all of it. I'm listening. My father was one of the Brotherhood's biggest supporters until about 2 years ago. He funded their activities, helped cover up their mistakes, even provided legal protection when things got messy." Lana's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Then he started asking questions about where the money was really going, about matches. That ended strangely, about students who disappeared from the program without explanation. Jonas leaned forward, intrigued despite the danger of being associated with this conversation. "What happened to him?" "Car accident. Single vehicle, late at night, on a road he'd driven 1,000 times before." Lana's voice was flat, emotionless, but her eyes betrayed the pain she was trying to hide. "The police called it driver error, said he fell asleep at the wheel, but he'd been receiving threatening phone calls for weeks before it happened." The weight of her revelation settled over the table like a shroud. They were talking about more than academic corruption now. They were discussing murder, conspiracy, the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the Brotherhood's power structure. Why are you telling us this? Imani asked. Because I think they killed my father, and I think they're planning to do something similar to you. Lana reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder. I've been collecting evidence for months. Financial records, email communications, even some audio recordings of conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. The folder contained dozens of documents, photographs, and printed emails that painted a picture of corruption extending far beyond Iron Vale Academy, match-fixing scandals involving major tournaments, bribery of officials at state and national levels, even connections to underground gambling operations that used academy students as unwitting participants. This is incredible, Jonas whispered, flipping through bank records that showed suspicious transfers of money coinciding with major tournament results. If this got out, it would destroy dozens of careers, including mine, Lana admitted. I'm named in some of these documents as someone who helped manipulate footage and provide false testimony when investigations got too close to the truth. Imani looked up from a particularly damning email chain between Coach Renshaw and a tournament official. So why risk everything to help us? Because living with the guilt was killing me. Because every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who had chosen comfort over conscience. Lana's voice strengthened with conviction. And because I recognized something in your fighting style that I'd seen before, in old footage of your grandfather. She pulled out a photograph that made Imani's blood run cold. It showed Moses Carter, Coach Renshaw, and a much younger man she didn't recognize, all wearing matching Iron Vale Academy jackets. They were standing beside a tournament trophy, their arms around each other's shoulders like old friends celebrating a victory. This was taken at the 1997 National Championships, Lana explained. 3 days before your grandfather was accused of using performance-enhancing drugs and stripped of his title. Imani stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the image, a friendship with everything she knew about her grandfather's disgrace. You're saying Renshaw was involved in framing him? I'm saying the Brotherhood has been covering up scandals for decades, and anyone who threatened to expose them ended up destroyed. Lana flipped the photograph over, revealing handwritten text. The Brotherhood, charter members. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, forming a picture that was both clearer and more terrifying than Imani had imagined. Her grandfather hadn't been destroyed because he was guilty of cheating. He had been destroyed because he was getting too close to exposing the real cheaters. That evening, as Imani processed the revelations from lunch, she was surprised to find a familiar figure waiting for her outside her apartment building. Elijah Summers sat on the front steps, his hood pulled up despite the warm weather, looking like someone who had grown comfortable living in the shadows. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. They walked to a nearby park, choosing a bench, beneath a broken streetlight where the darkness would provide some measure of privacy. Elijah kept his hands in his pockets and his voice low, habits developed during 3 years of avoiding detection. "Lana told you about the Brotherhood," he said. "It wasn't a question. How did you?" "Because I've been watching, waiting for someone, to finally connect the dots." Elijah's expression was grim in the half-light. "They destroyed your grandfather the same way they tried to destroy me, the same way they'll destroy you if we don't stop them first. What really happened to you? Why were you expelled?" "I caught them fixing a match during the 2022 state championships. One of the judges was taking money to influence scoring, and I had video evidence to prove it." Elijah's hands clenched into wide fists. "Instead of investigating, Renshaw accused me of academic misconduct, planted evidence in my locker, and had me expelled before I could present my findings to the State Athletic Commission. But you stayed hidden. Why?" "Because running away felt like admitting guilt, and because I knew eventually someone else would stumble onto the truth." He looked directly at her, his eyes reflecting a determination that had been forged in years of isolation. "Someone like you, who wouldn't be intimidated, or bought off, or silenced." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in thought about the magnitude of what they were facing. The Brotherhood wasn't just a corrupt organization. It was a cancer that had metastasized throughout the entire sport, influencing everything from local competitions to national championships. "There's something else," Elijah said finally. "The Winter Invitational is coming up in 2 weeks, It's televised nationally, with scouts and media from all over the country. If we're going to expose them, that's our best chance. What are you thinking? Live broadcast. Hundreds of witnesses. Impossible to cover up or explain away. Elijah's smile was cold but determined. We hijack their moment of glory and turn it into their public execution. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and probably illegal. It would require careful coordination, flawless timing, and a willingness to risk everything on a single moment of truth. But as Imani thought about her grandfather's legacy, about the students who would come after her, about the corruption that would continue to flourish if left unchallenged, she realized they didn't have a choice. What do you need from me? Keep training, keep competing, keep being the kind of fighter that makes them nervous. Elijah stood to leave, pulling his hood back up. And be ready when I give the signal. We're going to finish what Moses Carter started one way or another. As he disappeared into the shadows, Imani remained on the bench, staring up at the stars that were barely visible through the city's glow. Somewhere in that vast darkness, her grandfather's spirit was watching, waiting, to see if his granddaughter had inherited not just his techniques, but his courage to fight for what was right regardless of the personal cost. The war was far from over, but for the first time since arriving at Iron Vale Academy, Imani felt like she was no longer fighting alone. 2 weeks had passed since the formation of their unlikely alliance, and the Winter Invitational arrived with the fanfare reserved for events that would shape careers and determine futures. The Iron Vale Academy Gymnasium had been transformed into a professional arena, complete with elevated seating, professional lighting, and camera crews from 3 major sports networks. Scouts from colleges across the country filled the VIP section, their clipboards ready to document the next generation of martial arts stars. Coach Renshaw moved through the controlled chaos like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, his smile perfect for the cameras while his eyes remained cold and calculating. This was his moment, the annual showcase that brought funding, prestige, and national attention to Iron Vale Academy. Everything had to be perfect, which meant anything that threatened that perfection had to be eliminated. Ryder Thompson warmed, up in the corner designated for elite competitors, his movements sharp and precise despite the psychological weight of his first defeat. The draw ruling had technically preserved his undefeated record, but everyone present that night knew the truth. He moved with the desperate energy of someone trying to prove that his earlier loss had been a fluke, an aberration in an otherwise perfect career. Remember what we discussed, Renshaw said quietly, approaching Ryder during a break in his warm-up routine. Miss Williams has had her moment in the sun. It's time to restore the natural order. Imani entered the arena wearing her grandfather's mended GI, the faded fabric a stark contrast to the pristine uniform surrounding her. She had spent the past 2 weeks training harder than ever before, not just in the destroyed Red Room but in community centers and neighborhood gyms throughout the city. Word of her performance had spread beyond Iron Vale's insular community, drawing support from fighters who understood what it meant to compete against more than just your opponent. Mr. Benson watched from his usual position in the shadows, but tonight his maintenance uniform seemed more like camouflage than work clothes. Hidden beneath his cart were recording devices, backup hard drives, and communication equipment that would ensure the truth could not be buried no matter what happened during the competition. Assistant Coach Mendez approached Imani as she prepared. For her first match, his expression troubled despite the festive atmosphere surrounding them. "There's something you should know," he said quietly, pretending to check her equipment while actually slipping her a small USB drive. "I found this on my desk this morning. No note, no explanation, just a label that says, 'The final piece. Imani.'" Palmed the drive smoothly, understanding instinctively that this was what they had been waiting for. The evidence that would complete their case against the Brotherhood and finally vindicate her grandfather's memory. The preliminary matches began, with the usual pageantry, but Imani's fights drew an energy that went beyond normal competition excitement. She moved through her first 3 opponents with a fluid grace that reminded longtime observers of fighters from an earlier era, when technique mattered more than politics and heart counted for more than connections. Between matches, Jonas and Lana worked their way through the crowd, positioning themselves near the broadcast control room according to Elijah's carefully orchestrated plan. They moved casually, like spectators seeking better viewing angles, but their true purpose was far more significant. "Security sweep in 5 minutes," Jonas whispered into the concealed microphone hidden beneath his tournament volunteer badge. "Everyone in position?" Elijah's voice came back through their earpieces, steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Ready on my end. Imani, how are you holding up?" Imani touched her earpiece briefly, a gesture that would look like adjusting her hair to any casual observer. "3 down, 2 to go before the finals. My shoulder's holding up and I'm feeling strong." But as she prepared for her 4th match, one of the tournament officials approached with news that sent a chill through her entire team. "Change in your water supply," the official said, holding out a sealed bottle with Iron Veil's logo. "Academy policy. All competitors must use approved hydration during televised events." Imani stared at the bottle, remembering the bleach-filled water from her early days at the academy. But refusing would draw attention they couldn't afford, and accepting meant trusting that their enemies wouldn't risk obvious sabotage during a nationally televised event. "Thank you," she said, taking the bottle but not immediately drinking from it. Jonas watched the exchange from across the arena, his expression growing alarmed as he recognized the official as someone who had been present during several of the suspicious meetings documented in Lana's evidence files. "Don't drink that," he said urgently into his microphone. "Repeat, do not drink that water." But Imani was already engaged with her 4th opponent, a technically gifted fighter from a rival academy who had no connection to Iron Veil's corruption, but represented a legitimate challenge to her tournament hopes. The match was grueling, testing both fighters' endurance and skill in ways that drew appreciative murmurs from the scout-filled crowd. It was during this fight that Jonas made a crucial decision. He intercepted another official carrying an identical water bottle toward the fighter's area, confronting him directly despite the risk of exposure. "What's in the bottles?" Jonas demanded, his voice carrying enough authority to make the official pause. "Standard electrolyte solution. What's it to you, kid?" Jonas grabbed the bottle and unscrewed the cap, immediately detecting a faint chemical odor that confirmed his worst fears. "This is drugged. You're trying to sabotage her performance." The official's expression shifted from annoyed confusion to something much more dangerous. "You don't know what you're talking about, son. Walk away before you get hurt." But Jonas had spent too many weeks watching injustice triumph to back down now. Instead of walking away, he raised his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby. "Spectators! This man is trying to drug our fighters. Someone call security." The confrontation created exactly the kind of scene that broadcast directors loved. Unexpected drama that would keep viewers engaged during the slower moments between matches. Cameras swung toward the altercation, capturing both Jonas's accusations and the officials' increasingly desperate attempts to control the situation. In the broadcast control room, Lana watched the monitors with growing excitement. This wasn't part of their planned exposure, but it was creating the perfect distraction for what came next. "Now," she whispered into her microphone, "while all the cameras are on Jonas." Elijah's fingers flew over his laptop keyboard, uploading years of collected evidence to every social media platform simultaneously while hijacking the arena's internal communication system. Within seconds, the same damning documents that had convinced Lana to switch sides were flooding the internet, tagged with hashtags that would ensure maximum visibility. But the real masterstroke came when the arena's main screen suddenly cut away from the tournament brackets to display a video that made the entire crowd gasp in recognition. It was security footage from 1997, showing a young Moses Carter in heated conversation with Coach Renshaw just hours before the championship match that would destroy his career. The audio quality was poor, but advanced enhancement software had made the conversation audible to anyone willing to listen. "I won't be part of this anymore," Moses's voice echoed through the arena speakers. "These kids deserve honest competition, not predetermined outcomes." "You'll do what's best for the academy," Renshaw replied, his voice cold with threat. "Unless you want your granddaughter to grow up knowing her hero was a coward who walked away when things got difficult." The implication was clear. Moses Carter had been blackmailed into compliance, threatened with exposure of manufactured evidence unless he agreed to lose the championship match that would have cemented his legacy. The crowd erupted in chaos. Reporters pushed toward Coach Renshaw, demanding answers to questions he had hoped would never be asked. Tournament officials struggled to maintain order, while secretly communicating with off-site handlers who were probably already planning their own escapes. In the midst of the pandemonium, Imani found herself face-to-face with Ryder Thompson on the tournament mat. The finals had begun almost without notice, the two fighters who had defined Iron Vale's internal conflict now representing much larger forces in a battle that transcended sports entirely. "Still think you belong here?" Ryder asked, his voice lacking its usual confidence as the scandal unfolded around them. "More than ever," Imani replied, settling into her fighting stance with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found her true purpose. The match that followed was unlike anything the tournament had ever seen. Two fighters at the peak of their abilities, representing not just different academies but different philosophies about what martial arts should be. Ryder fought with textbook precision, every technique perfect according to modern standards. Imani fought with flowing creativity, channeling decades of accumulated wisdom through movements that seemed to bend reality itself. The crowd fell silent as the match progressed, mesmerized by a level of skill that transcended the corruption and politics surrounding it. Even the reporters stopped asking questions, recognizing that they were witnessing something that occurred perhaps once in a generation. When Imani finally secured the winning submission, the same triangle choke that had defeated Ryder 2 weeks earlier, the arena exploded with appreciation that had nothing to do with academy loyalties or sponsor obligations. This was pure recognition of excellence, the kind of moment that reminded everyone why they had fallen in love with martial arts in the first place. But instead of celebrating, Imani released the hold early and helped Ryder to his feet, her expression compassionate rather than triumphant. "You're better than them," she said quietly, her words meant for him alone. "Don't let their corruption define who you become." The aftermath of the Winter Invitational unfolded with the swift brutality of a house of cards collapsing. Coach Renshaw was led away in handcuffs before the evening news cycle began, his carefully constructed reputation crumbling under the weight of evidence that painted him as the architect of decades of systematic corruption. The FBI had been investigating the Brotherhood for months, and Elijah's data dump provided the final pieces needed to bring federal charges. Ryder Thompson sat in the Academy's empty locker room 3 days later, staring at the suspension letter that effectively ended his competitive career. The investigation had revealed his participation in multiple instances of match fixing, though prosecutors acknowledged that he had been coerced into compliance through threats against his family's financial security. "I'm sorry," he said when Imani found him there, his voice hollow with genuine remorse. "For everything. The harassment, the sabotage, the way we treated you from day one." Imani settled onto the bench beside him, her championship medal heavy in her hands. The victory felt different now, colored by understanding of how much corruption it had required to expose. "We all made choices," she said simply. "What matters is what we choose to do next." Jonas knocked on the doorframe, his expression cautious, but hopeful. The past few days had been a whirlwind of media interviews and investigation meetings, but he had emerged from it all with a surprising offer. "They want me to help rebuild the Academy's youth program," he announced, still seeming amazed by his own good fortune. "Turns out there's funding available for instructors who actually care about teaching kids self-respect, along with self-defense." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Jonas, the awkward white belt who had been targeted for recruitment by the High Brotherhood, was now being entrusted with shaping the next generation of fighters. His genuine love for the art, combined with his proven integrity under pressure, made him exactly the kind of teacher Iron Vale needed if it hoped to survive the scandal. Lana appeared in the doorway behind him, her expression reflecting the complex emotions of someone who had lost everything she thought she wanted and discovered something much better in its place. "My new academy called," she said, holding up her phone with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "They want me to start next week. Clean slate, honest competition, coaches who actually care about developing character along with technique." She had chosen to transfer to a smaller academy across town, one founded by former Iron Veil students who had left years earlier after becoming disillusioned with the Brotherhood's influence. Her father's life insurance money, freed from legal limbo by the criminal investigation, would fund scholarships for underprivileged students who showed promise both on and off the mat. Mr. Benson emerged from the shadows one last time, his maintenance uniform replaced by a simple suit that suggested he had shed more than just his janitor's disguise. The investigation had revealed his true identity, a former federal agent who had been working undercover for 3 years, building the case that would eventually bring down the Brotherhood. Moses would be proud, he said, approaching Imani with something that looked like a metal case. This belongs to you now. Inside the case was her grandfather's original 1997 championship medal, the one that had been stripped from him based on fabricated evidence. The State Athletic Commission had formally restored his title the previous day, along with a public apology that would never fully repair the damage done to his reputation, but at least acknowledged the truth. "Keep it," Imani said, closing the case and pushing it back toward him. "Grandpa's real legacy isn't made of metal." She gestured toward the academy around them, where new students were already beginning to arrive for classes taught by instructors who had been vetted for integrity, rather than connections. The Iron Veil Academy name would survive, but everything else about the institution was being rebuilt from the ground up. 2 weeks later, Imani stood in what had once been her grandfather's basement dojo, now expanded and properly equipped with funding from the legal settlements that had emerged from the Brotherhood's collapse. The space had been transformed into a community training center, open to anyone who wanted to learn regardless of their ability to pay. A nervous 11-year-old girl stood in the doorway, clutching a registration form and looking like she wasn't sure she belonged there. She was small for her age, dressed in second-hand clothes with the kind of quiet determination that Imani recognized immediately. "Are you the teacher?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a teacher," Imani replied, kneeling down to meet the child at eye level. "What's your name?" "Keisha. Keisha Jackson. My mom said you might be able to help me learn to protect myself." Imani smiled, remembering her own first day at Iron Veil Academy and how different this moment felt. There was no hierarchy here, no politics or corruption or predetermined outcomes, just a teacher and a student, both committed to the ancient art of learning how to be better than they were yesterday. "Let's start with the basics," she said, leading Keisha toward the mats that had been worn smooth by generations of fighters. "First rule, martial arts isn't about fighting. It's about understanding yourself well enough that you don't have to fight unless there's no other choice." As they began the first lesson, Imani felt her grandfather's presence in the room, not as a ghost or memory, but as a living legacy that would continue through every student she taught, every life she touched, every young person who learned that strength came from character rather than connections. 3 months later, she sat for a nationally televised interview that had drawn viewers from around the world. The journalist was professional, but clearly impressed by the story that had already been optioned for 3 different movie deals. "Looking back," the interviewer asked, "do you regret anything about how this all unfolded?" Imani considered the question carefully. The investigation had destroyed dozens of careers, revealed corruption that extended far beyond Iron Veil Academy, and fundamentally changed how competitive martial arts were regulated at every level. Some innocent people had been hurt in the process, careers ended by association rather than actual wrongdoing. "I regret that it took so long for the truth to come out," she said finally. "I regret that my grandfather didn't live to see his name cleared, but I don't regret fighting for what was right, even when it seemed impossible." What advice would you give to young people facing similar situations? Corruption, injustice, systems that seem designed to keep them down. "Be relentless," Imani replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had tested herself against forces much larger than any individual opponent. "But remember that being relentless isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how much you're willing to rise, how many times you're willing to get back up, how long you're willing to keep fighting for something bigger than yourself." The interview ended with footage of her community dojo, where dozens of students, from every background imaginable trained together under the banner that had replaced Carter's Way. The new sign read simply, Legacy Academy, representing the understanding that true inheritance came through service rather than blood, through lifting others up rather than keeping them down. Later that evening, Imani visited her grandfather's grave for the first time since the investigation began. She placed both championship medals on the headstone, his restored 1997 title, and her own Winter Invitational victory, along with a single white belt, symbol of the beginner's mind, that Moses Carter had taught her to maintain regardless of how many victories she accumulated. "We won, Grandpa," she whispered to the gathering darkness. "Not just the matches, the war, and now the real work begins." Above her, the stars shone with the ancient light of dreams that refuse to die. Dreams that pass from generation to generation like sacred flames. Dreams that remind us that every ending is really just another beginning in disguise. What would you sacrifice to expose a truth that could destroy everything you've worked for? And when corruption runs so deep that silence feels safer than speaking, up, do you have the courage to be the one who breaks the cycle? If Imani's fight for justice inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of underdogs who refuse to back down when the odds are stacked against them.